My designation is Chief Medical Assessor Iron Vosktel, and I have spent 31 years processing recruits out of frontline training for medical incompatibility. 31 years of forms, of scans, of gentle conversations with young beings who were not built for what the front lines demanded of them. I want you to understand that number before I tell you what happened on the day we tried to wash out the human. 31 years. I had never once seen my dosage protocol fail. Not once. Until a species with no natural armor, no venom glands, no claws and skin you could puncture with a sharpened stick sat up on my examination table 4 minutes after a paralytic dose calibrated to drop a Threll war bull, looked me directly in the eye and asked in a perfectly level voice whether we had anything stronger. I need to back up because you won't understand how strange that moment was, unless you understand how ordinary the morning had been up until then. The Continuum Defense Auxiliary Program had been running for 6 cycles by the time humanity submitted its first cohort of frontline candidates. I want to be clear that nobody on the review board wanted them there. This wasn't hostility. Not exactly. It was closer to embarrassment, the kind you feel when a child wanders into an adult conversation and insists on being taken seriously. Humanity had been part of the wider continuum for less than 11 years at that point, newly uplifted, newly surveyed, newly catalogued, and their species file was, frankly, unimpressive on paper. Average bone density lower than a Threll juvenile, no exoskeletal plating, no venom resistance, no natural weapons beyond blunt fingernails and teeth that couldn't puncture most hide types in the quadrant. Their homeworld classification, and I remember this specifically because I pulled the file myself, was listed as Class 3, Temperate Biosphere, Moderate Hazard, Standard Gravity Baseline. Moderate Hazard. I want you to hold on to that phrase, because by the end of this story, you will understand exactly how much of a joke it turned out to be. The frontline training program existed for one reason. The Continuum's outer rim was contested territory. Harassed constantly by raiding factions we generally referred to as the Unbound, fragmented pirate confederations that struck fast, hit soft infrastructure, and vanished before proper fleet response could be organized. Frontline units needed bodies who could survive first contact with these raiders for the 90 seconds it typically took for reinforcements to arrive. 90 seconds doesn't sound like much until you're the one standing in a burning corridor waiting for it to pass. Every species that wanted to contribute personnel to frontline units had to pass their candidates through a physical assessment first. This wasn't a formality. It was, by continuum law, a mandatory screening designed to protect fragile species from being sent somewhere their bodies simply could not survive. It sounds compassionate when I put it that way, and in most cases it was. But I will be honest with you, because this story deserves honesty more than it deserves my professional pride. The physical assessment had, over the decades, quietly become something else as well, a gatekeeping mechanism. A polite, bureaucratically defensible way of keeping species that command staff considered undesirable out of combat rotations without ever having to say so out loud. And humanity, in the eyes of most of the senior command staff at Thrabos Station where I was posted, was considered exactly that. Undesirable. Not because of any specific incident, because of assumption. Because of a file that said moderate hazard, standard gravity, no natural weapons, and because every human anyone on that station had actually met stood a full head shorter than the average Thrall soldier, and looked, in the words of Fleet Director Osvan, like something you'd find pressed between the pages of a botany textbook. I did not agree with Director Osvan's assessment, I want that on the record, but I also did not disagree loudly enough, and that is a failing I've had a long time to sit with. The human candidate assigned to my clinic that morning was named Elias Wren, 29 years old, by his species reckoning, which our translators inform me placed him solidly in early adulthood. Former structural rescue technician according to his file, which meant he had spent several years of his life crawling into collapsed buildings after earthquakes, and tunnel collapses to pull other humans out of the wreckage. I remember reading that line in his file and thinking it sounded almost noble in a small, sad way. Humans dig each other out of rubble with their hands. It read like folklore. It did not read like a threat assessment. He arrived at the clinic 11 minutes early, which our administrative staff noted with mild surprise because most candidates arrive precisely on time or slightly late, anxious about the assessment. He sat in the waiting alcove reading something on a small handheld device, legs crossed, utterly unbothered. My assistant, a young Fenray technician named Cass Ibren, told me afterward that she'd tried to make conversation with him about the assessment process, expecting nervousness, and instead he'd asked her what the weather was like on Fenra Prime, because he'd never met anyone from there before and was curious. She said it threw her completely. She'd been trained to comfort anxious candidates. She had no training in what to do with one who wasn't anxious at all. I called them back at the scheduled time. Standard procedure for frontline physical assessment includes a full biometric scan, a stress reactivity test, a pain threshold evaluation using calibrated pressure application, and finally, as the last and most decisive stage, a controlled exposure to a neurotoxic compound we call verathine. Verathine is derived from the venom glands of the Karsuvi lancewing, a predatory arthropod native to a high-gravity world in the outer sectors. In its purified, medically standardized form, it's used specifically because of how reliably it works. Across species, it's a paralytic. It shuts down voluntary motor control by disrupting nerve signal transmission at the synaptic junction, and it does this with almost perfect consistency across every known biology in the Continuum's medical database. Threl, Fenray, Corvasi, Deathka, all of them go down within 90 seconds of a standard dose and stay down for a minimum of 20 minutes. It is, and I want to stress this, one of the most reliable diagnostic and screening tools in continuum medicine. We don't use it to hurt candidates. We use it because a body's reaction to controlled paralysis, how fast the toxin metabolizes, whether the cardiovascular and respiratory systems compensate, whether there's any adverse neurological response, tells us more about frontline survivability than almost any other single test we run. Raters use neurotoxins. If you can't survive verathine in a clinical setting, you have no business being on a station under attack. That's the official justification, and it's a true one. But I would be lying to you if I said that was the only reason the dose that morning was set at 140% of standard protocol. I found out about the elevated dosage order after the fact from the digital requisition log, timestamped 4 hours before Elias Wren's appointment. It had been authorized by Director Osvan directly, flagged as a special protocol adjustment for, and I am quoting the requisition note exactly, verification of species baseline given anomalous file discrepancies. There were no anomalous file discrepancies. I checked. Osvan had simply decided that the standard dose might not be enough to produce a decisive failure and had quietly ordered it increased, on his own authority for one candidate, on one morning, without informing me until I was already standing in the room with the syringe in my hand and Wren sitting calmly on the examination table in his medical gown. I want to tell you, I refused. I did not refuse. I raised an objection, verbally on the record, noting that a 140% dose exceeded standard protocol tolerances and represented, in my professional opinion, an elevated and medically unnecessary risk to the candidate. Osvan's response, relayed through the comm panel, because he did not have the courage to be in the room himself, was that the dose remained within the outer bound of the medically approved range and that my objection was noted and overruled. I administered the injection. I have thought about that moment nearly every day since, and I want you to know that whatever else this story becomes, it begins with a wrong I did not stop. Elias Wren watched me prepare the injector with the same mild curiosity he'd shown Cass Ibren in the waiting room. He asked what the compound was. I told him honestly that it was a standardized neurotoxic paralytic, used to assess baseline physiological resilience. He nodded slowly. The way you nod when someone confirms something you already suspected, and said, "Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens." I have turned that sentence over in my mind more times than I can count. Not fear, not defiance even, curiosity. As if his own body were an experiment he was mildly interested in the results of. The injection went into the muscle of his upper arm at 09:14 station time. I logged it precisely because precision is what 31 years of this job trains into you. Standard onset for Verathene at baseline dose is between 40 and 90 seconds for the first observable symptoms, tremor in the extremities, pupil dilation, a drop in voluntary grip strength. At the elevated dose Osfan had ordered, I expected onset closer to 30 seconds and full paralysis, loss of voluntary motor control across the body, respiratory muscles included, requiring assisted ventilation, within 2 minutes. At 30 seconds, Elias Wren reported unprompted that his fingertips felt slightly numb. I noted this. It was consistent with early onset. At 45 seconds, he mentioned that his vision had gone a little blurry at the edges and asked if that was expected. I confirmed that it was. At 60 seconds, which is where every other species I had ever tested with this compound was already exhibiting significant tremor and beginning to lose fine motor control, Elias Wren was sitting exactly as he had been, upright, hands resting on his knees, blinking slowly, and said, "Okay, that's interesting. My hands feel kind of far away, like they're not really mine." I asked him to try to make a fist. He did, slowly, and it was weaker than his baseline grip strength test from earlier that morning. But it was a fist, a functional closing fist, 90 seconds after a dose that should have already dropped him into unresponsive paralysis. I want to describe what I was feeling in that moment, because I think it matters. It wasn't alarm. Not yet. It was confusion of a very specific, very clinical kind. The confusion of an instrument reading something outside its calibrated range. I had run this test functionally identical to it, on hundreds of candidates across a dozen species. I had never once seen a baseline dose subject retain fist function at 90 seconds, let alone a subject dosed at 140%. I checked my equipment. I want you to know, I actually stopped and checked whether the injector had malfunctioned, whether the compound had been improperly mixed, whether somehow a diluted or expired batch had been substituted. Cass pulled the batch record for me while I continued monitoring Wren. The batch was fresh, properly calibrated, verified 3 days prior by an independent lab technician, no irregularities. The injector's internal flow sensor confirmed full delivery of the dose, 140% of standard, correctly administered into the muscle tissue exactly where it was supposed to go. The compound was fine. The delivery was fine. The human was simply not reacting the way every other tested species in continuum history reacted. At 2 minutes, the point at which Wren should have been in full flaccid paralysis, requiring ventilator support, he told me his legs felt heavy, like he'd been standing in cold water too long, and that his vision had mostly cleared back up. He asked if he could have a glass of water. I gave him one. He drank it without spilling a drop. His hand a little unsteady, but perfectly capable of the coordinated motion required to bring a cup to his mouth and drink from it. At 3 minutes, he flexed his fingers, rolled his shoulders, and said his hands felt normal again, though his legs still had some of that pins and needles thing. He asked what the expected duration of the effect was supposed to be. I told him, and I remember my voice not sounding entirely steady when I said it, that the typical duration for full paralysis at his dose level was 20 to 25 minutes minimum. At 4 minutes and 12 seconds, Elias Wren stood up off the examination table, tested his balance by rocking slightly on his feet, nodded to himself as though confirming something, and sat back down. 4 minutes. A 140% dose of a compound that reliably drops every documented species in the Continuum's medical registry for a minimum of 20 minutes. And the human had walked it off in under 5, most of the visible effect gone by minute 3. I did not say anything for a moment. I genuinely did not know what to say. 31 years of protocol had not prepared me for a data point that simply refused to fit the model. And it was in that silence, while I was still trying to reconcile what my monitoring equipment was telling me with what I understood to be physically possible, that Elias Wren looked at me, entirely calm, entirely pleasant, and said, the sentence that I have replayed in my mind more times than any other in my professional career. If that was supposed to knock me out, it didn't really do much. Do you have a stronger dose? I want to make sure this wasn't just some fluke with my body chemistry specifically. Might be useful to know for the record. I want to sit with that request for a moment, because I think its plainness is what makes it extraordinary. He wasn't defiant. He wasn't performing strength for an audience because there was no audience, just me and Cass and a monitoring console. He wasn't even particularly impressed with himself. He asked the question, the way you'd ask a mechanic to double-check a reading on an engine gauge that seemed off. Practical, curious, faintly concerned that the data might be unreliable and that unreliable data helps no one. I told him, truthfully, that administering a second stronger dose so soon after the first would fall outside every safety protocol I was authorized to follow, and that I would need to consult with senior medical staff before considering it. He said that was fine, he understood, and asked if he could at least finish the rest of the standard assessment while we sorted that out, since he still needed to complete the pain threshold and stress reactivity portions anyway. I finished the assessment. I want to walk you through the results because each one on its own might have been dismissible as an outlier, a strange individual case, a fluke of one candidate's unusual physiology. Together, they told a very different story. The pain threshold evaluation uses a calibrated pressure application device on several nerve dense points across the body, gradually increasing force, while the candidate reports discomfort levels on a standardized scale, and while the monitoring equipment separately tracks involuntary physiological stress markers, heart rate elevation, cortisol analog, hormone spikes, muscle guarding. It's designed to measure the point at which pain begins to compromise a candidate's ability to function under combat stress, because a soldier who freezes or panics under minor pain is a liability regardless of how physically strong they are. Elias, Wren's self-reported discomfort scale climbed steadily, and honestly, he wasn't stoically claiming to feel nothing. He told me clearly when something hurt. But his physiological stress markers, the involuntary ones, the ones a person cannot consciously fake or suppress, remained almost flat, well past the threshold, where every other species I'd tested began showing significant autonomic stress response. His heart rate increased, modestly, predictably, and then plateaued. There was no spike, no panic signature. When I finally reached the upper calibration limit of the device, a pressure level that had, in Threll test subjects, produced audible distress and request to stop the test roughly 2/3 of the way there, Wren simply exhaled slowly through his nose, said, "Yeah, that's not great," and asked if we were close to done. The stress reactivity test presents a candidate with a series of simulated emergency scenarios through neural-linked sensory feedback, essentially placing them inside a controlled hallucination of combat stress, hull breach alarms, sudden decompression warnings, the sensory approximation of nearby weapons fire, and measures decision-making speed and accuracy. Under that simulated duress, this is typically where we see the most dramatic drop-off in performance, even among species that test well physically, because raw resilience and clear decision-making under panic are very different skills. Elias Wren's decision accuracy under the simulated crisis scenario was 96%, the highest score I had personally ever recorded in that clinic. And his reaction times did not slow as the simulated stressors escalated. If anything, they got marginally faster. When I asked him afterward, out of genuine professional curiosity rather than protocol, how he'd managed to stay so composed during a simulation specifically engineered to induce panic, he shrugged and said something that I wrote down verbatim because I wanted to remember it exactly. He said, "Where I'm from, emergencies don't wait for you to calm down first. You learn to think while you're scared, or you don't get to keep doing the job. After a while, it just becomes what your brain does automatically. Panic's optional past a certain point of training. Mostly. I noted that qualifier. I did not understand at the time how much weight it was carrying. By the time I finished compiling the full assessment report, it was early afternoon, and I had a decision in front of me that 31 years of experience had not remotely prepared me to make. Standard procedure: when a candidate's results fall within expected parameters, whether pass or fail, is a routine filing, reviewed by a mid-level administrator, closed within a day or two. Standard procedure has no clear provision for a candidate whose results don't merely pass the frontline threshold, but who obliterates it so completely that the data itself becomes suspect. I made the call that I believe, looking back across 31 years, was the single most important professional decision of my career. I did not file it as routine. I flagged the entire assessment for mandatory senior medical in command review, citing, in the flag notation, statistically anomalous physiological resilience data requiring verification and reclassification consideration. I fully expected this to result in a quiet, mildly annoyed meeting with a couple of administrators who would tell me I'd made an error in my equipment calibration and to resubmit the paperwork. What actually happened was that within 6 hours, the flag had been escalated 3 tiers above my authority, and I received a summons to appear in person before Fleet Director Osvin, his senior medical officer, and, to my genuine astonishment, a representative from Continuum Central Command's Species Classification Bureau, who had apparently been alerted the moment the anomaly flag crossed a certain threshold of statistical deviation. I want to explain briefly what the Species Classification Bureau actually is, because I don't think most people outside medical and command circles fully understand its weight. Every species in the continuum is assigned a threat and capability classification, a multi-factor rating that determines everything from military deployment eligibility to trade regulations to diplomatic protocol to, frankly, how seriously anyone bothers to take you in a negotiation. These classifications are not casually adjusted. They are built from decades, sometimes centuries of aggregated data, and once a rating is set, it typically stays stable unless something extraordinary forces a review. The Bureau does not send representatives to outer rim medical facilities for routine matters. The Bureau sends representatives when a classification might be fundamentally wrong. The representative's name was Auditor Prensk Delorian, a tall, angular Corvasi with a particular flat, unreadable expression that species is known for, and the very first thing he did upon entering the review room was not greet anyone. It was asked to see the raw sensor logs from the assessment, unfiltered, before anyone had a chance to summarize or interpret them for him. I gave him everything. Every timestamp, every reading, the injector's delivery confirmation log, the pain threshold telemetry, the stress reactivity accuracy scores. He reviewed it in silence for what felt like an extremely long time, occasionally making a small sound that I eventually understood to be his species' equivalent of a surprised intake of breath. Director Osvan, to his credit or perhaps to his discredit, depending on how you want to read it, tried to get ahead of the situation immediately. He suggested, before Delorian had even finished his initial review, that the results were most likely attributable to equipment malfunction or human physiological measurement error, given that our sensors were calibrated primarily around Threl, Fenray, and Corvasi baseline biology, and might simply be misreading human vitals. Auditor Delorian did not look up from the display when he responded. He said, and I remember this precisely because of how quietly devastating it was, "The equipment is not malfunctioning, Director. I've cross-referenced the delivery confirmation against the injector's independent flow meter, which operates on a completely separate diagnostic system from the vital sign sensors you're suggesting might be miscalibrated. The dose was delivered in full, at 140% of standard protocol, which I notice is itself an irregularity requiring its own explanation. The candidate's vitals were recorded using 3 redundant sensor arrays that agreed with each other to within margin of error. This is not measurement error. This is a data point that does not fit our existing model of the species, which means our existing model of the species requires revision, not the data." I watched Director Osvin's face when Delorian said that, and I will admit, quietly, that there was a small, ungenerous part of me that took some satisfaction in it. Delorian then asked a question that changed the entire shape of the afternoon. He asked whether the candidate had actually requested a second elevated dose, and whether that request had been formally logged. I confirmed that it had. I pulled up the recording because our examination rooms record audio for liability purposes and played back the exact moment where Elias Wren, sitting on the table with the numbness barely faded from his hands, calmly asked whether we had anything stronger so we could rule out a fluke. The room went quiet after that recording played. I want to describe the quality of that silence, because it wasn't confusion anymore, the way my own silence had been in the exam room. It was something closer to the silence you get when a room full of professionals suddenly, simultaneously, understands that the scale of a problem is much larger than they'd assumed. Auditor Delorian asked to speak with the candidate directly. I should explain something about how these species classification reviews typically work, because it will help you understand why what happened next was so unusual. Under ordinary circumstances, a candidate is not present for their own reclassification review. They are informed of outcomes after the fact, through official channels, with no input into the deliberation itself. This isn't cruelty, exactly, it's just how the bureaucracy is built, treating candidates as subjects of assessment rather than participants in it. Delorian overruled that convention immediately, on his own authority, which I understood later was itself a signal of how seriously he was taking this. He wanted Elias Wren in the room answering questions directly because, as he put it, I am not interested in a third-hand summary of an anomaly this significant. I want to hear it from the source. Elias Wren was brought into the review room a little over an hour later. I want to describe how he entered that room because it tells you almost everything about the tone of what followed. He was still in his own clothes by then, having been released from the clinic hours earlier pending the outcome of the review. And he walked in, looking frankly like a man who'd been called into a meeting about a parking violation. Mildly curious, not remotely intimidated by the presence of a fleet director, a senior medical officer, and a Continuum Central Command auditor, all seated around the same table waiting for him. Delorian opened without much preamble. He asked Wren to describe, in his own words, what he had experienced during the Verathene exposure. Wren described it more or less exactly as I had observed it. Numbness in the extremities, some blurred vision, a heaviness in the legs, all fading within a few minutes. When Delorian asked whether this matched his expectations going into the test, Wren said, and I found this answer more illuminating than almost anything else that day, honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect, because I didn't know what compound you were using specifically, but I've had worse reactions to bad shellfish. I figured whatever this was, probably wasn't going to be the thing that took me out. Delorian asked him to elaborate on that comment, and this is where the conversation moved from strange to genuinely revelatory, because Wren, apparently taking the question at face value as a request for relevant medical history, began explaining, without any apparent sense that he was saying anything remarkable, the sheer breadth of toxic and venomous exposure that is simply a background feature of growing up on Earth. He talked about a creature called a box jellyfish, whose venom, he explained, could stop a human heart in minutes, and which nonetheless drifted through the same waters humans swam in recreationally. He mentioned snakes, dozens of species, some capable of killing an adult human in under an hour, that lived in close enough proximity to human settlements that encountering one was considered an ordinary if unwelcome part of daily life in certain regions. He described something called the poison dart frog, a creature small enough to sit on a fingertip that carried enough neurotoxin in its skin to kill several grown men. And he said this with the tone of someone describing an interesting fact from a nature documentary rather than a horror he had personally lived alongside. Auditor Delorian, to his credit, did not interrupt this, though I could see him taking notes with an intensity I hadn't seen from him all afternoon. When Wren finished, Delorian asked the obvious question. He asked whether humans had developed some kind of specific biological or medical countermeasure to this apparently constant background threat of toxic exposure. Some evolved resistance that might explain the Verathene result. Wren thought about that for a moment, and then said something that I believe, more than any single piece of raw data from the physical assessment, was the moment that truly reframed the entire conversation. He said, "Not really. No. I mean, we've got antivenoms for specific things, medically, but that's treatment after the fact. Not built-in resistance. Mostly, it's just that if you grow up somewhere with that many things that can kill you, your body and your nervous system sort of get calibrated to keep functioning. Even when something's actively trying to shut you down, because the alternative is you just die every time something bites you. And evolutionarily, that's not a great strategy. So I think what you're seeing, isn't that we're resistant to your specific compound. I think it's that our baseline tolerance for things attacking our nervous system is just set really, really high, because it had to be. We didn't get the luxury of a planet that wasn't trying to kill us most of the time. I watched Auditor Delorian's expression during that answer, and I want to describe it because it's the closest I've ever seen a Corvasi come to visible alarm. Corvasi don't display emotion the way Threll or humans do. Their facial structure doesn't really allow for it, but there's a particular stillness that settles over them when they're processing something they find deeply concerning. And that stillness settled over Delorian like a physical weight. He asked, very carefully, whether this meant that most humans, not specially trained combat candidates, but ordinary members of the species going about ordinary civilian life, possess this elevated baseline tolerance to neurotoxic disruption. Ren said, with what I can only describe as genuine puzzlement at the question, that yes, more or less, though obviously training and physical conditioning affected the specifics, but the baseline nervous system resilience wasn't something you had to be a soldier to have. It was just, in his words, part of the standard equipment. Part of the standard equipment. I want you to sit with that phrase, because the verathine compound that had failed to fully incapacitate Elias Ren was at baseline dose, capable of dropping a Threll war bull, an animal bred and engineered over centuries specifically for battlefield durability, in under 90 seconds. And here was an ordinary human civilian, a structural rescue technician, not a soldier, not a genetically enhanced specimen, telling us, without any apparent awareness that he was saying anything extraordinary, that his species considered this level of resilience to be standard. Fleet Director Osvan, who had been largely silent since Delorian's earlier rebuke, finally spoke up, and I think his question, though clearly motivated by a desperate desire to salvage his earlier position, was actually a fair one. He asked whether it was possible that Ren was simply an outlier within his own species, an unusually resilient individual whose results shouldn't be generalized to humanity as a whole. This is the point where Auditor Delorian did something that I think, in retrospect, showed exactly why Central Command trusts him with cases like this. He didn't answer the question himself. He turned back to Ren and asked him directly. Ren considered the question with what looked like genuine effort to be fair and accurate rather than defensive. He said that he probably tested somewhat above average given his professional background and physical training, but that the specific reaction to the toxin, the underlying nervous system resilience rather than any trained skill, wasn't something he thought was unusual for a human. He said, if we wanted a more statistically representative answer, we should test a broader sample ordinary civilians across a range of ages and physical conditions rather than relying on one data point from one physically fit rescue worker. And then he said the sentence that I believe ultimately triggered everything that followed. He said, but if you want my honest guess, I don't think you're going to find that I'm the outlier. I think you're going to find that the compound's baseline dose was calibrated against species that don't have to deal with what we deal with, and it's just never going to hit us as hard as you're expecting, no matter who you test it on. That's not me being special. That's just what growing up on my planet does to a nervous system. I have sat in a great many professional meetings across 31 years, and I have rarely felt a room shift the way that room shifted after Ren said that. Because what he was describing, in his calm, unassuming, faintly apologetic tone, was not an anomaly. It was a species-wide baseline that had been fundamentally misjudged, and misjudged in a way that touched not just medical protocol, but the entire threat classification framework that governed how the continuum interacted with humanity across every domain: military, diplomatic, economic. Auditor Delorian closed the meeting shortly after that, informing everyone present, including Ren, that he would be initiating a formal expanded review, and that this would require a significantly larger testing sample from the human population, conducted under proper controlled conditions with full informed consent, rather than the ad hoc authentic, frankly unethical, elevated dosage protocol that had triggered this whole situation in the first place. I noticed he made a specific point of looking at Director Osvan when he said that. I want to pause the story here to explain what happened over the following weeks, because I think it matters just as much as the initial incident, maybe more, since it's the part that actually changed things rather than just revealing them. The expanded testing program that Auditor Delorean authorized was, by continuum bureaucratic standards, remarkably fast to organize. I suspect this was because Delorean personally understood the stakes involved and pushed the paperwork through channels that would normally have taken months. Within 3 weeks, a proper, ethically supervised study had been conducted involving over 400 human volunteers from Earth and several off-world human colonies, spanning a genuinely representative range of ages, physical conditioning levels, and health backgrounds. From elite military candidates down to sedentary civilians well past what humans consider middle age. I was invited to consult on the medical side of this study, partly because I've been the one to flag the original anomaly, and partly, I suspect, because Delorean wanted a witness to the process who had first-hand experience with just how wrong our initial assumptions had been. The results, when the full data set came back, were almost uncomfortable to read, in the sense that they made you question every prior assumption you'd built a career on. The baseline neurotoxic tolerance across the human sample was elevated compared to continuum median species by a margin the statisticians described as several standard deviations, not from a handful of exceptional individuals skewing the average, but consistently across nearly the entire tested population. Even the least physically fit human volunteers in the study, people who by their own admission rarely exercised and had no combat or emergency response training whatsoever, metabolized standard dose verathine within a window that would have been considered exceptional resilience in any other continuum species. The research team that compiled the final report included an extensive section attempting to explain the biological mechanism behind this, and their conclusions largely tracked with what Wren had said in that review room, offered almost as an aside, without any sense that he was describing something historically significant. Human evolutionary history, it turned out, had unfolded on a planet with an extraordinarily high density of venomous and toxic organisms across nearly every biome, alongside a long history of exposure to naturally occurring toxins and food sources, environmental hazards, and disease vectors that had exerted sustained selective pressure across hundreds of thousands of years. The result was a nervous system and a broader physiological toxin response system that had been shaped by relentless exposure into something that simply did not fail the way our medical models expected it to. There was a secondary finding buried in the report that I found almost more unsettling than the primary result, because it reframed something that everyone in the continuum had always assumed was simply a quirk of human culture, rather than a piece of evolved biology. The report noted that human tolerance for pain, separate from but related to their neurotoxic resilience, also tested significantly above continuum median, and that human psychological stress response under simulated combat conditions showed a pattern researchers described as delayed onset panic threshold, meaning humans could function with high decision-making accuracy for substantially longer under acute crisis conditions before their stress response began degrading performance compared to virtually every other species in the comparative dataset. One of the senior researchers on the study, a death physiologist named Orvin Kastra, included a personal note in the report's closing summary that was later quoted, somewhat controversially, in several continuum medical journals. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, that the continuum's classification systems had been built around an implicit assumption that resilience correlated with visible physical traits, size, armor, natural weaponry, and that humanity represented what he called a category error baked into our entire framework, a species whose true resilience was almost entirely internal, invisible on a medical scan, until you actually pushed past the point where every other species would have already failed. I think that phrase, category error baked into our entire framework, is probably the single most important sentence to come out of this whole affair, because it forced an admission that the problem wasn't really about humans at all. It was about the continuum's own blind spots, built from centuries of dealing with species whose capabilities were, for the most part, visible on the surface. The formal reclassification hearing took place roughly 2 months after that initial incident in my clinic, and I want to describe it because it was, in its own quiet, bureaucratic way, one of the more dramatic events I've ever witnessed, despite involving no violence, no shouting, nothing that would look exciting if you filmed it. The Species Classification Bureau's reclassification hearings are conducted in a large circular chamber on Central Command's primary station, with representatives from every major continuum member species present, either physically or through delegate proxies. Reclassifications of this magnitude, ones that touch military deployment doctrine, are rare enough that the chamber was, I was told, more fully attended than it had been in over a decade. Auditor Delorian presented the findings personally. He walked the assembled representatives through the entire chain of events, starting, somewhat pointedly, with the original elevated dosage order and the circumstances surrounding it, which I noticed made several representatives glance toward the Threll delegation, since Director Osvan's conduct had, by that point, become something of an open secret within medical and command circles. Delorian did not name Osvan directly in his presentation, which I think was a deliberate choice, focusing the hearing on the classification question rather than turning it into a disciplinary spectacle. Though I later learned that Osvan was quietly reassigned to a non-command administrative post shortly after the hearing concluded, which I think most of us who'd worked under him considered a fairly restrained consequence given what he'd authorized. Delorian then presented the full, expanded study data, walking the chamber through the statistical resilience findings, the pain threshold data, the stress reactivity results, and the biological explanation the research team had developed regarding Earth's evolutionary pressures. I watched the reactions across the chamber as he spoke, and what struck me most was how the mood shifted over the course of maybe 40 minutes, from polite, slightly bored institutional attention to something noticeably more alert, more uneasy. The Corvasi delegation predictably asked the most technically probing questions, wanting to understand the statistical methodology behind the resilience claims in granular detail, which Delorian answered patiently and thoroughly, clearly having anticipated exactly this line of scrutiny. The Threll delegation's questions were more pointed in a different direction, focused less on the science and more on the practical military implications, and I remember one Threll representative, an older general, whose name I unfortunately never caught, asking a question that I think crystallized what everyone in that room was actually worried about beneath the polite scientific language. He asked quite directly whether this reclassification implied that humanity's actual combat capability had been systematically underestimated across every prior joint operation the Continuum had conducted involving human personnel, and if so, what that meant for the broader assumption, unspoken but structurally present throughout Continuum military doctrine, that humans were a junior-dependent species whose contributions were primarily logistical or symbolic rather than spatsitive. Delorian's answer to that question is the part of the hearing that I think about most often. He said that the study's findings didn't allow him to speculate about combat capability in the tactical sense, since resilience to toxins and elevated pain thresholds don't automatically translate into strategic or martial skill. But he said, and this is close to verbatim because it was recorded and I've listened to it several times since, what I can say with confidence is that this species has been operating within our institutions for over a decade, with a physiological resilience baseline that our own screening tools failed to detect. Using methods we considered rigorous and reliable across every other species we have ever tested. That failure is not a minor administrative footnote. It means we have been making policy, deployment, and classification decisions about an entire species based on data we now know to be substantially incomplete. I would suggest that the appropriate response is not simply to update one number in a database, but to seriously examine what other assumptions about this species might also warrant re-examination. There was a long silence in the chamber after that. I don't think it was hostile silence. I think it was the silence of a room full of very senior, very experienced officials realizing, collectively, that they'd been operating with a significant blind spot for over a decade and trying to work out how uncomfortable that realization should actually make them. The eventual outcome of the hearing was a formal upward revision of humanity's continuum threat and resilience classification, moving them from what had been an unremarkable mid-tier rating into a category the Bureau reserves for species considered to possess what the official language calls significant undocumented physiological capability requiring expanded operational consideration. It's dry, bureaucratic phrasing, but its practical effects were not dry at all. It triggered a mandatory review of every joint military protocol involving human personnel, updated medical response guidelines across every continuum facility that might treat human patients, and, perhaps most consequentially, it opened a formal review into human eligibility for frontline combat roles that had previously been restricted, quietly and without official justification on the basis of assumed physical inadequacy. I want to come back to Elias Wren now, because I think it would be a disservice to this story to let it become entirely about committee hearings and classification codes and lose sight of the person at the center of it. A person who, throughout this entire process, seemed almost bemused by the scale of the reaction his one strange morning had produced. I spoke with him again about 6 weeks after the hearing, partly for a follow-up medical consultation that was now standard procedure for the handful of human candidates who'd gone through the original assessment protocol, and partly, I'll admit, because I was curious how he felt about having become, without ever intending to, the catalyst for what several continuum medical journals were now calling the most significant species reclassification in over 40 years. He was characteristically unimpressed with his own significance. When I asked him directly how it felt to have triggered this entire process, he shrugged, in that particular human gesture that I've come to understand signals a kind of deliberate modesty, and said that he honestly hadn't done anything except ask a reasonable follow-up question when a test result seemed off. He said, and I wrote this down because I thought it captured something important about how differently humans and most other continuum species approach uncertainty. If a reading doesn't match what you expect, you don't just shrug and move on. You check it again. That's not bravery. That's just not wanting to make a decision based on bad data. It seemed obvious to me. I guess I didn't realize nobody had thought to actually check before. I asked him whether he'd been frightened, even briefly, during those first 90 seconds after the injection, when his body was reacting to something his medical file gave him no reason to expect he could handle. He thought about that question for a while before answering, longer than he'd taken with any other question I'd asked him, and I think that pause was itself an honest answer. He said that he'd felt something, a kind of distant, clinical alarm, watching his own hands go numb, and not knowing exactly how far that numbness was going to spread or whether it would stop before it reached something that mattered. His lungs, his heart. But he said that alarm and fear are different things, and that his training, both the formal rescue technician training and just the general unspoken cultural training of growing up somewhere that demanded a level head in emergencies, had taught him to keep functioning through the alarm rather than being controlled by it. He said, "You feel it. You just don't let it drive. You feel it. You just don't let it drive." I've used that phrase since in training discussions with new medical staff, because I think it's one of the more elegant descriptions I've encountered of what actually separates raw physical resilience from the kind of composure that makes someone reliable under genuine crisis. Elias Wren's frontline training application was unsurprisingly, given everything that followed, formally approved, and not merely approved but expedited, given the Bureau's now urgent interest in properly understanding human combat integration going forward. He completed the full training program roughly 8 months later, and I'm told, though this is second-hand information from colleagues who tracked his subsequent record, that he went on to serve with distinction in several frontline deployments against unbound raiding parties over the following years, developing something of a quiet reputation among mixed-species units for exactly the qualities his original assessment had revealed. Unnatural calm under pressure, a body that simply refused to go down the way enemy combatants expected it to, and an almost unsettling habit of walking toward exactly the kind of danger that made every other species in his unit instinctively want to run. But I think the more important legacy of that morning in my clinic wasn't Elias Wren's individual career, as remarkable as it turned out to be. It was the ripple effect that expanded reclassification had across the entire way the continuum approached humanity going forward, and I think it's worth walking through some of those ripples because they illustrate just how deep the original misjudgment had actually gone. Within a year of the reclassification hearing, continuum medical facilities across dozens of stations had updated their emergency response protocols for treating human patients, because it turned out that standard sedation and pain management dosages calibrated for other species were often significantly undershooting what humans actually required for. effective treatment, an uncomfortable irony given that the original incident had been about an overdose, not an underdose, but which made a certain grim sense once you understood the underlying resilience baseline. Human patients had, for over a decade, been receiving medical care calibrated against models that fundamentally misunderstood their physiology, sometimes to their detriment in ways that had simply gone unnoticed because nobody had thought to question the assumption. Military doctrine review took considerably longer, as these things tend to in large bureaucratic institutions, but within 3 years, human personnel had been fully integrated into frontline combat rotations across every major continuum defense sector, no longer restricted to logistical support or diplomatic roles. I'm told that several of the unbound raiding factions operating along the outer rim developed over that same period a notably increased reluctance to engage stations and convoys known to have human personnel aboard, which several continuum intelligence analysts attributed directly to a string of engagements where human soldiers had proven dramatically more difficult to neutralize, incapacitate, or intimidate than raiding tactics had been designed to expect. There's a particular incident from about 4 years after the original classification. Hearing that I think deserves mention because it circulated fairly widely through continuum military circles and became something of a case study in exactly the kind of miscalculation the original reclassification had tried to warn everyone about. An unbound raiding group attempted to seize a mid-sized continuum supply station using a tactic that had worked reliably against them for years, a coordinated strike using a paralytic gas compound functionally similar to the verathine used in medical assessments, but weaponized and delivered through the station's ventilation system, intended to incapacitate the defending garrison before boarding parties moved in to secure the facility with minimal resistance. The station's garrison included a joint Threll and human defense unit. The Threll soldiers, along with every other non-human defender aboard, went down within the expected window, exactly as the raiders had planned. The human soldiers did not. I'm told the raiding party's boarding teams walked into that station's central corridor, fully expecting an easy, unopposed seizure, and instead found themselves facing a small number of human defenders who were disoriented, certainly affected by the gas to some degree, but very much still standing, still armed, and still capable of coordinated resistance. The raid failed, badly by most accounts, and the incident report that Continuum Defense Command eventually filed on the engagement included a line that I think closes this whole story out better than anything I could write myself, because it comes from an institution that had, only a few years earlier, been actively trying to find medical grounds to keep humans out of exactly this kind of frontline role. The report noted in typically dry military language that adversary tactical doctrine developed against continuum standard species profiles demonstrates significant and exploitable gaps when applied against human personnel, whose physiological resilience baseline continues to diverge substantially from historical assumptions. And then, almost as an afterthought, a final recommendation that future joint force planning should proceed from the assumption that human units would remain combat effective under conditions that would neutralize any other species in the continuum, rather than treating such outcomes as anomalous. I think about that phrase a great deal, because it represents the complete inversion of where this entire story started. Humanity had entered the continuum as an assumed anomaly in the wrong direction, underestimated, dismissed, quietly gatekept out of roles that command staff didn't believe they deserved. And within a handful of years, the official military doctrine of that same institution had flipped entirely, treating human resilience not as a strange exception to be tested and doubted, but as a baseline reality to be planned around. I retired from active clinical practice about 2 years ago after 33 years total, and I want to be honest that the incident with Elias Wren remains, without much competition, the single most significant event of my entire career. Not because of the drama of it, though. I've certainly told the story enough times at professional gatherings that I probably embellish small details without meaning to at this point, but because of what it taught me about the specific, quiet danger of institutional assumption. 31 years at the time it happened.